Hello and welcome back everyone. For today's video we are continuing our chess tournament, which is Norway Chess 2024, and this is round 3 of the tournament. We are having Praggnanandhaa with the white pieces playing versus the god himself, Magnus Carlsen, with the black pieces, so let's see how it goes. And I promise you, as we are having as usual of our videos, we get only the interesting, the crushing games, and we will show them to you. So we get pawn to e4, and now pawn to c5 from Magnus, knight to f3 from white, pawn to e6 from Magnus, and now pawn to d4 from Praggnanandhaa, going into the open Sicilian after this trade happens in the center. And now we get pawn to a6 from Magnus Carlsen, going into the Khan variation of the Sicilian defense. Mainly a6 is played because black wants to go queen to c7 and he wants to prevent white from playing knight to b5, hitting his queen. So we get bishop to d3 from Prag, we get queen to c7 from Magnus, and now Praggnanandhaa just castles. We get knight to f6 from Magnus, putting pressure on the pawn on e4, also trying to play pawn to d5. We get queen to e2, preventing black from going pawn to d5 because he will capture, and if you recapture back, you cannot recapture back with your pawn due to this pin. So we get pawn to d6 from Magnus, pawn to c4 from Praggnanandhaa, and we are having the Morozzi-bind pawn structure from white. We get knight b to d7, and now knight to c3. Knight to c3 is mainly played to try to stop black from ever pushing that pawn on d5. So we get knight to e5 hitting the light square bishop, and Prag says, okay, you know what, you can have my bishop, and just plays pawn to h3. Pawn h3 is a preventive move, so preventing black from ever going to g4, and later on he just wants to play pawn to f4. And Magnus sees that bishop, he's thinking, should I capture that bishop or not? And he decided to not and played pawn to b6 because that bishop is not really a good bishop. He's blocked by its own pawns, so it's really not going anywhere. We can capture it anytime, so he played pawn to b6. And right now Prag gets angry and says, okay, so either you are giving me the knight or you're retreating back, or give me that knight for that bad bishop I have. So knight takes d3 was played, and queen takes d3 was played by white. Bishop to b7, putting pressure on the pawn on e4. Also at the main point, black is trying to push pawn to d5, as if black pushed the pawn on d5, he is going to be completely equalizing the game, of course without losing the pawn. So we get pawn to f5 from Prag. Prag is going really in angry mode, he's trying to checkmate Magnus, he's saying, okay, give me that pawn on e6. So Magnus just defends it with queen to d7. The engine is saying it is inaccuracy and you could have gone pawn to e5 in one go, because after bishop to g5 threatening to capture the knight and damaging the pawn structure on the king side, we get bishop to e7 from Magnus defending the knight, and now we get rook a to d1. So rook a to d1 is putting a major pressure on the pawn on d6 and trying say, okay, black, where is your king going? What are you doing about your weakness on d6? What are you going about any sacrifices with pawn to e5? What are you doing with any captures on e6? So it's really complicated position. So we get rook to c8 from Magnus, putting pressure on the pawn on c4, as it is one of his main ideas. If he couldn't go pawn to d5, then okay, he might as well try to push the pawn to b5. So we get queen to e2 from Praggnanandhaa. Praggnanandhaa is trying to play for pawn to e5, and Magnus at the same time, he would love to have his queen on c7 to put pressure on that pawn, and if white tries to defend it with pawn to b3, there is always going to be pawn to b5, which is the nice idea behind this opening. So we get pawn to e5 from Magnus, and this is why queen d7 was a mistake at the first place. We get bishop takes f6 from Praggnanandhaa, bishop takes f6 from Magnus, and now knight c2. Knight c2 is trying to go knight to e3 and use that outpost on d5, and white is simply having a nicer position. So we get queen to c6 from Magnus, putting pressure on the pawn on e4, also putting pressure on c4. So right now, if white tries to defend it with pawn to b3, You know what are you going to play in this position. As I just explained, you will push the pawn on b5, exploiting that the c4 pawn is pinned to the knight on c3. So of course Pragg doesn't do that, and Pragg goes knight to e3 to try to occupy that lovely square on d5. We get bishop to g5 from Magnus. Magnus trying to exchange his bishop for that knight, and we are having a 2 bishops versus 2 knights. What is going to be better? We don't know. We get king to h1 from Pragg. The engine really doesn't like the idea of trading that really strong knight that is going to be on d5 for that bishop. We get bishop takes e3 from Magnus, and now queen takes e3 from Praggnanandhaa. Praggnanandhaa is saying, okay, if you take my pawn on c4, in fact, I will not capture the pawn on b6, but instead I will go f6 first. And if you capture, then great, you just gave me an open file for my rook, and the next rook is coming, and you will be in dangerous spot. So Magnus didn't capture the pawn on c4, but instead he played pawn to f6 himself first to prevent white from pushing his own pawn to f6. And now we just get b3 from Praggnanandhaa. And now, as I explained before, we get pawn to b5, exploiting that pin and also putting a major pressure on that pawn on c4. So we get knight to d5. Knight to d5 is a great move, because if black intended to capture the pawn on c4, then at the end of that variation there is rook to c1, which is a major problem. There is also knight to b6, just winning yourself a nice little exchange after queen c5. You won't really win an exchange, but you will get such a nice position after rook to d6 as white. The engine is saying it's about equal, but the major problem after queen takes c4 that there is rook to c1, and rook c1 is such a strong move because there is no queen to c5 right now, and white will immediately just win the game. And this is why knight to d5 is such a great move. We get queen to c5 from Magnus. Magnus is trying to exchange some little exchanges to get to an end game where his king is on the center, and it's better than the king on h1. But Pragg of course understands that, and he immediately moves his queen away to f3. He's trying to go queen to h5 check and do some damages to the black position. We get b takes c4 right now, and now immediately queen to h5 was played. So Magnus just baited. Okay, what will you do after king to f8? You've got nothing. And Pragg says, okay, I will just develop my rook, try to put pressure on from the g file, also from the b file, and okay, I will just chill. So we get bishop takes d5, as this knight is so dangerous on d5. And okay, you may think right now that okay, all of the pieces got exchanged. What's so crazy about the game? The game looks like a draw. There is not really such a huge thing for either side, but you will believe me, the game will go crazy shortly. So we get queen to b6 from Magnus, and now b takes c4, and now rook takes c4. So Magnus right now is up a pawn, but there is a major pressure or a major problem that black has, which is that rook on h8 is not participating at the game at all, and those two rooks is participating. So technically you can say that white is not up material, but in fact white is considered being up a rook in this position. So we get rook to b3 from Praggnanandhaa, putting pressure on the black's queen. Also, if the black queen leaves away, then there is rook to b8 or rook to b7. So rook to b4 was forced by Magnus, and now we get rook d to d3, retreating that rook back to defend the other rook. And after rook takes b3, we get rook takes b3, hitting the black queen again, and now we get queen to c7, and now we get queen to d1 from Praggnanandhaa. Praggnanandhaa is trying to prevent Magnus from delivering any weird checks on c1. Also at the same time, he's rerouting his queen to d5, where after he could go rook to b7 and try to deliver some checkmates on f7. We get pawn to g6 from Magnus. Magnus shouting out loudly. He's trying to, okay, I wanna play the rook. The rook is not participating at the game. So we get queen to b1 from Pragg. He says, okay, you can do whatever you want, but if you play such a lazy move like pawn h5, for example, like let me just show you the idea. After rook to b8, you will have to move your king, then after rook to b7, you will lose your queen due to this pin. So black has got to be careful here. Magnus puts his queen on c5, and he's just praying to not getting checkmated. So we get rook to b7 from Praggnanandhaa. Praggnanandhaa is trying to occupy the second rank. He's saying that rook is not participating. I wanna play you with the rook up. So we get g takes f5, and now a slightly such a strong but a silent move, which is king to h2. This is such a nice move by Pragg, and the idea behind it that if white intended to move his queen, for example queen to b3, to try to go queen to f7 check, then there is queen to c1, and after king to h2, the game will end with perpetual checks, as the black queen will continue delivering some checks on the white king, and white can't really escape it, because it is just a perpetual check after queen to f4. If white tries to go pawn to g3, then there is going to be queen to f2, king to h1, and queen f1, and okay, we will repeat forever, and the game will end up in a draw. So that's the idea behind that nice and silent move, which is king to h1. Also right now the pawn on e4 is defended. Right now you don't have any checks with black, so I am threatening queen to b3 myself and checkmate you easily. So we get rook to g8 from Magnus, trying to put some sort of pressure on the pawn on g2, but it is already too late for this rook to join the game. So we get queen to b3 from Magnus, threatening checkmate in 1. We get pawn to d5 from Praggnanandhaa. Magnus is really hoping to play an endgame here, where he could really fight the position, but after rook takes h7, immediately Magnus just resigns the game. And why he resigned? Because right now queen to b8 is a checkmating threat. So the only way to defend it pretty much is going back to c8, which is such a dubious move, because there is queen to a3, and after the king's move, then there is queen to e7. Also, there is another way you may ask, that rook to g7. Rook to g7 will end up being losing as well, because queen to b8 check is so strong, because after king to f7, then there is going to be queen to b7, and the rook on g7 is tossed away and it is gone, and black will lose either way, whether he resigns respectively or not. It is just all the same result of the game. Thanks you guys for watching. If you liked the video, try to also watch the previous video. We had such an amazing nice start of the tournament between Fabiano and Hikaru Nakamura. Make sure to watch it and stay tuned for the next videos.